Draft Asian Development Bank 13 Replenishment of the Asian Development Fund Order 2024.
Is it the wish of the committee that the instruments be debated together? Agreed. I will now call on the Minister to move the first motion and speak to both instruments. At the end of the debate, I will put the question on the first motion and then ask the Minister to move the second formally. I call the Minister to move the first motion.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve in this committee with you in the Chair, and I beg to move that the committee has considered the draft Asian Development Bank 13th Replenishment of the Asian Development Fund Order 2024 and, thanks to the committee's permission, the Inter-American Investment Corporation Further Payments to Capital Stock Order 2024 laid before the House on the 4th of November. These draft orders will permit the UK Government to make separate financial contributions to the Asian Development Fund and the Inter-American Investment Corporation up to the stated values. Allow me to briefly take the committee through the background and purpose of the draft orders, if I may, Chair. First, when it comes to the Asian Development Fund, or ADF as I'll call it for short, this is the grant arm of the Asian Development Bank. It supports the most vulnerable countries in the Asia-Pacific and it's replenished by donors every 4 years. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, as I'll call it for the rest of this speech, is one of the largest sources of development finance in the region, providing over $23 billion in 2023. ADB is an important partner for the UK. It plays a key role in the achievement of regional development objectives on sustainable development and climate change. In line with multilateral development bank reform priorities to support the most vulnerable, the UK has committed £120 million to ADF to maintain our position as the 4th largest donor. This order allows for the provision of this core funding by the UK. During this replenishment, a record high of 38%, almost $2 billion, will be funded from ADB's own net income, reducing the cost to donors of achieving the same development impact. The total value of the replenishment is therefore $5 billion. This replenishment will prioritise dedicated assistance to small island developing states, which are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and also to countries in fragile and conflict-affected situations, including Afghanistan and Myanmar. It will support much-needed climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, promote gender equality, support regional integration and provision of regional public goods, and increase the living standards of poor and vulnerable people in the region. Specifically, Chair, ADF will dedicate at least 45% of its financing for climate mitigation and adaptation, commit $900 million for Afghanistan and $200 million for Myanmar, providing vital support for basic human needs and livelihood development. Increase commitments to Pacific Island states to $1.3 billion, some 35% of total replenishment financing, and allocate 20% of thematic funding to gender transformative action, which will tackle violence against women and girls, ensure access to sexual and reproductive services, and promote access to economic resources such as land and asset ownership. ADF is an essential lifeline to the region's most vulnerable people who have faced multiple crises over the last few years, including climate change, coronavirus, and the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. ADF provides excellent value for money for the taxpayer, leveraging around $11 from the bank's resources for every $1 contributed by donors. This is one step closer to building a bigger, better and fairer international financial system, one that delivers for everyone. Moving, if I may, Chair, to discuss the Inter-American Investment Corporation. This order permits the UK Government to make further payments to the Inter-American Investment Corporation, also known as IDB Invest, which is the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. The Inter-American Development Bank Group, or IDB as I'll call it for the rest of this speech, is Latin America and the Caribbean's largest source of development finance, providing around $24 billion in 2023 alone. IDB is also a trusted UK partner and is instrumental to the achievement of regional development objectives on sustainable development, action on climate change, biodiversity protection, and pandemic and disaster preparedness. Furthermore, the G20 have called upon multilateral development banks to adopt new business models to stretch their balance sheets, increase lending and make riskier investments. And the UK has been at the forefront of these calls with the new government. Now, this is exactly what IDB Invest is committed to do, and why, together with other shareholders, the UK agreed to a $3.5 billion capitalisation package to allow IDB Invest to more than double the support it provides the region from around $8 billion to $19 billion per year. It will do this through the implementation of a new business model. IDB Invest will shift to a so-called originate-to-share approach to attract private capital, share risks and recycle funds, enabling greater impact and scalability for development projects. The UK is a strong proponent of this new model and the leadership and innovation that's been showcased by IDB Invest. For this reason, we aim to achieve at least a 5-fold increase in our shareholding from 0.22% up to 1.5%, subject to shares being available, for a total value of up to $106 million. Let me lay out some of the outcomes IDB Invest expects to achieve by 2030 through this new business model and capital increase. It will dedicate at least 60% of investments to climate and green finance. It will finance 2.5 million micro, small and medium enterprises, which could in turn support 9.5 million jobs. It will create over 300,000 women as direct beneficiaries of their programmes and support 1.6 million of the region's poor and vulnerable people. It will improve access to agricultural services and investments for 44,000 farmers. And it's predicted to reduce 3.9 million tonnes of CO2 emissions and generate 1.4 thousand megawatts from renewable sources for new clean energy projects. In addition to this, IDB Invest will continue to share lessons learned on the implementation of its business model with other development finance institutions to encourage more investment into the private sector globally. This represents excellent value for money. For every dollar the UK invests, $5 of development-related assets are generated, taking us one step closer to achieving the region's sustainable development goals. To conclude, both the Asian Development Fund and IDB Invest are instrumental to achieving UK objectives overseas and are amongst our closest and most important development partners. The financial contributions covered by these two orders will deliver UK international development and foreign policy objectives in some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries, and will bring opportunity to tens of millions of people globally through innovative reform processes. I commend these orders to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Asian Development Bank 13th replenishment of the Asian Development Fund Order 2024. I call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. It's a real pleasure to serve under your chair, I think, for the first time ever. I hope there'll be many more occasions. And I'd like to also thank the Minister for her very detailed and comprehensive explanation about the matters we are discussing today. But as you will imagine, I have a lot of questions and points of clarification that I would like to put to her this afternoon. So, first of all, I'd like to speak about the Asian Development Bank and the 13th replenishment of the Asian Development Fund Order 2024. Of course, Her Majesty's opposition recognised the important work outlined by the Minister that the bank does in different parts of that region. It was supported by the previous government, and the opposition continue to support the work of the Asian Development Bank. However, I would be grateful if the Minister could provide much more granular detail about the £120 million that she is proposing to spend, up to that amount. It's a lot of money, and I think that all of our constituents want to see justification for when money is spent, especially large sums of money of that kind. So, we have had a very high-level explanation today, but we do, I believe, need to go a bit deeper and look at some of the details. So, precisely what climate change mitigation should we expect to be funded? What kind of sustainable infrastructure development we will be looking at? And could the Minister elaborate on what the government is trying to achieve by means of deepening regional cooperation. What does she mean by that? The committee would, I believe, also benefit from knowing more information about the distribution of funds and how they will geographically spread across the region of jurisdiction, and which areas are priorities for His Majesty's government. Can the Minister also enlighten the House about what steps the Labour government are taking to help multilateral banks like the Asian Development Bank to take maximum advantage of the huge potential offered by private finance for development? As the committee will know, the previous government's, Conservative government's International Development White Paper published last year centred around mobilising financial institutions and private capital. This included making sure that every penny the UK was spending and funding for this embedded in the multilateral development banks goes as far as possible and is used to the best effect. What we would like to see is evidence of what the Labour government will be doing to pick up that baton and continue the work of the previous government. To that end, will the Minister confirm to the House what new initiatives are being undertaken by British international investment to help unlock greater volumes of private finance? The Conservative government championed British international investment's aspiration to try new approaches to secure more private finance, with a clear focus on equity investment to support businesses in developing economies accessing additional finance. So, does Labour support that? And does she agree that there could be lessons learned from the British international investment successes in this area that could influence the adoption of new business models by MDBs? United Kingdom aid is a powerful driver, Mr Vickers, for lifting people out of poverty, but only if it is complemented with the supporting economic development policies that enable countries in receipt of our financial assistance to develop and grow their own economic base through trade, employment and skills development. Is the government looking at furthering our work on economic prosperity by working with British firms which can offer skills, educational and employment development to countries, effectively promoting British interests overseas? Additionally,
Order. The Shadow Minister is moving beyond the scope of the regulation. Could I ask him to conclude his remarks, please?
Additionally, the Conservative government made good advances, both in spending power expertise as well as leveraging our position to reform and improve global aid system so that it can be manage the challenges of this century and address our national priorities. In this specific context, we need to make sure that the money going into the ABD and other MBDs is ultimately very clearly targeted at bringing about economic progress, because that is what drives human development in turn. Turning, if I may, Mr Vickers, to the Inter-American Investment Corporation. The UK became a member of the corporation under the last government, and we recognise its importance as the largest source of development finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, what assurances can the Minister give that the government is advancing the previous government's commitment to continually improve the effectiveness of development delivered through the corporation? The last government strongly supported the corporation's reform programme. Does the current government intend to do the same, particularly in relation to increasing the level of co-investment attracted from private investments and the allocation of capital? And to clarify, will she clarify whether the government will indeed look to purchase additional shares to take our holding up to 1.5%? In relation to how the funding will be used, does the Minister agree that we need to improve our partnership offer, in particular to the Caribbean nations, if we are to counter the growing economic and development presence of China in the region? And if she does agree, how does she intend to do this through our funding of the corporation, and what measures will be in place to scrutinise the effectiveness of our offer, investments and resources, so that the UK is not indirectly subsidising initiatives which could be counter to our national interests and foreign policy objectives. And so finally, Mr Vickers, will the Minister tell us about funding through the corporation, whether it will be supporting projects in support of the British overseas territories in that region? And can the Minister provide the details of priority countries and projects? To draw my remarks to the close, may I mention smaller aid and development organisations, because the discussion today is understandably, of course, centred on the role of big players. We must never forget the small charities with their dedicated volunteers and grassroots support who put their heart and soul into the great causes and often receive less attention and support that they deserve. So, can the Minister confirm whether, in addition to these big projects, the current government has a plan to support the smaller charities? It was, of course, a Conservative government which established the Smaller Charities Fund.
The Shadow Minister is... I've been very...
I'm drawing my remarks to conclude.
But if you could conclude, then the Minister needn't comment on the questions that are out of scope.
I'm now going to conclude, Mr Vickers. So finally, what time frame can the Minister outline on how and when the work of the corporation will be reviewed? Will the review be published and subject to full parliamentary scrutiny?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Vickers, and I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his questions and his interest in this critically important area. I'll endeavour to answer as many of his points as I can. First of all, when it comes to the Asian Development Bank, I was very pleased that the previous government supported its work as well. That was really encouraging to see. Also pleased that we now have, of course, a new president who's been announced, and I'd met with him when he was a candidate to become the new president for the Asian Development Bank, and he certainly shares the similar reform orientation to the new UK government. The mention that was made by the right honourable gentleman of the UK's funding, I think needs to be perhaps put in the context of the previous government's support. Of course, we're talking about up to 120 million now. That's a slight increase in the UK's contribution of 117.6 million that was, of course, made by the previous government. So I think it's helpful to put it in that context. When it comes to the connection between the schemes, the environmental schemes that are being focused on by the ADB and economic growth, I think that's very, very clear. So they've been previously very much focused on mitigation in terms of projects to deliver energy where it's required, making sure that that is done on a sustainable basis as possible, also infrastructure development as well, but above all, making sure that this is additional, that it's not crowding out private sector investment, that it really is focused on that core mission for MDBs, which is to be additional to any private funding. He asked about regional cooperation as well. Particularly important area there is, of course, encouraging intra-regional trade and also encouraging, for example, the integration of energy systems, becoming increasingly important with the climate crisis. So these have been areas that have been examined. He asked about overall reform, and certainly the new UK government would recognise the previous government was committed to reform, but we want to go far further and faster. That is what we have been pushing on, and what I believe we have been able to, I'm pleased to say, achieve. We really do want to make sure that every penny goes as far as it possibly can when we're talking about taxpayers' resources. I think we've seen that with the World Bank's openness to reform, what we managed to achieve in our negotiations around our IDA announcement, the fact that there was a commitment to make sure that every pound would be stretched on the balance sheet of the bank. They've been really clear about that, reforms that they're making. But I think also with the announcements that we're making today, I think that shows that strong push towards reform that is so critical. Also, finally, I would just mention the measures that we've been pushing with the Global Climate Fund as well, where we've seen really positive innovation, particularly around serving fragile and conflict-affected states, and the announcement they've made around funding in Somalia. He asked about BII. As he would expect, I've had very frequent interaction with BII since becoming the Development Minister. I was present there physically a couple of weeks ago. He asked about measures that are being undertaken now, that are being promoted by the new government, particularly around catalysing private sector growth. Well, BII, of course, is one of the few such organisations that has had an explicit focus on African nations, particularly those that are not able to access finance from other sources. Really pleased to see that the Financial Sector Deepening Africa project is proceeding apace and that we're seeing those investments going in to support small-scale businesses as well as larger ones. I was in Zambia last week, Chair, and saw some of that for myself. So it was really, really good to see that continuing work. He talked about the need to make sure that the UK's work is supporting development and growth in other countries. Absolutely, that is the core raison d'etre of our new approach to development, that it has to be focused on partnership, recognising just as the new UK government has as its core mission growing our economy, that is the core mission for our partners overseas as well, and we need to be working with them so that we can realise that mutual interest. He asked about British firms. There is a review which is being undertaken within FCDO, which is being led by Martin Donnelly, focused on economic diplomacy, not within the focus of this area, so I won't talk about it, Mr Vickers, but he may find it useful to find out more about that review. Finally, on the IADB, I've discussed the reform plans within that bank directly with its president. I believe that they have been in many ways a leader amongst multilateral development banks. I think it's been really positive that they've held the presidency of the grouping, bringing MDBs together for the first time so that they can share that knowledge about reform and pushing things forward. He asked about the Caribbean, and absolutely this fund will be focused on the Caribbean. I think it's really important that it does, and that is particularly the case when it comes to adaptation-focused investment. And IDB Invest is going to be making 10% of its investments in the Caribbean, and 60% of its focus is going to be towards pro-environmental and climate measures, including adaptation. That's particularly important for those countries, also for overseas territories, of course, as well, which are really being hammered by the impacts of the climate crisis right now. So I hope I have answered most of his questions. Just finally, he talks about the need for support for smaller charities. We would absolutely agree with that. I'm afraid I can't resist saying that, unfortunately, when it comes to the record of the previous government, we also had a huge amount of volatility around funding for international development. We're determined to deliver a longer-term approach where we're not seeing, particularly in donor refugee costs, eating up a very variable and, under the Conservatives, increasing amount of international development funding. We want to actually be bringing that proportion down over time, and of course we will make sure that there is information available about IDB Invest into the future. I know that the Inter-American Development Bank itself will be reporting on this, but if he has any subsequent questions on that, or indeed any other matter, I'd be more than happy to respond to it either in person or in writing. Thank you.
No other member is catching my eye. The question is that the committee has considered the draft Asian Development Bank 13th replenishment of the Asian Development Fund Order 2024. All of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The draft Inter-American Investment Corporation further payments to capital stock order 2024.
Minister to move formally.
Move formally.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Inter-American Investment Corporation further payments to capital stock order. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.